Imagine a night in Rome. The sky covered by heavy clouds, as if the very firmament felt the weight of what was to come. The streets, silent, hold the echo of what happened a few months ago in the pulsating heart of the Republic, the Senate. A space where the fates of kings and peoples were decided, now stained by blood. The blood of a man who dared to cross the boundaries of tradition, who challenged time, nobility, the very gods. The man who proclaimed himself perpetual dictator. Julius Caesar. Inside that cold marble hall, among statues of ancestors that seemed to weep with eyes carved in stone, the blades rose against him. For idealism, for fear, for envy. Brutus, the son not of blood, but of soul, made the final thrust, sealing what he believed to be the rebirth of freedom. But what they truly unleashed was a dormant demon, revenge. Caesar's death did not bring peace, nor did it restore the ancient glory of the Republic. On the contrary, as if Rome had been wounded in the chest, it began to bleed from the inside out. The open scar in the Senate grew, transforming into an abyss that would divide not only the city but the Roman world. And it was in this void that the heirs of pain emerged, the architects of the end, Octavian and Mark Antony. Octavian, the young man with a fragile appearance, almost pale like a spectre, but with eyes fixed on power like an eagle on its prey. A name few knew, but soon to be etched in fire in history as Augustus, the first emperor. And beside him, Mark Antony, the passionate soldier, the loyal, the audacious. A man who had wept before Caesar's body and now wielded the sword to wash that death with blood. But no empire is built without resistance. On the other side of the inner ocean, in the vastness of the eastern provinces, two men were preparing. Men who called themselves defenders of the Republic. Men who had touched the blade that killed Caesar. Brutus and Cassius. A philosopher and a strategist. A dreamer and a realist. United by a deep guilt, justified by an even deeper idea, the freedom of Rome. The war was not merely a struggle for territory or power. It was a clash of visions, of legacies, of ghosts. Philippi, in Macedonia, would be the stage for this collision. Not just of armies, but of worlds. There, the ancient gods would silently watch the confrontation between the last republicans and the first emperors. The ground, still fertile with the blood of past wars, would be watered again. And the winds would bring the scent of death mixed with the sound of swords. The Second Triumvirate marched with full force. It was no longer a political game. They had marked cards, execution lists, and an uncontainable hatred burning in their eyes. Octavian did not forgive. Mark Antony did not forget. And both were willing to crush anyone who dared to contest the new destiny of Rome. A destiny shaped not by votes, but by blades. On the other side, Brutus held the standard with trembling hands. He was not made of steel like the generals. He was made of words, of honor, of tragedy. But he knew he could not retreat. Because marching with him were not just soldiers, the dream of a people who still believed in the Republic marched with him. Cassius, colder, more experienced, saw beyond hope. He knew the price of war. He understood that what was about to happen at Philippi was not a battle, it was a judgment. The last judgment of Rome. And when the sun rose over the fields of Macedonia, gilding the shields and revealing the metallic shine of thousands of spears, everyone knew there would be no forgiveness. The birds fell silent. The earth trembled under the sandals of the legionaries. And time, for a brief moment, seemed to hold its breath. It was no longer about revenge. It was no longer about ideals. It was something greater. It was destiny. A destiny forged by mistakes, by betrayals, by broken promises and unfulfilled oaths. On that day, every soldier marching to Philippi carried on their shoulders the history of an empire on the brink of its definitive transformation. Some fought for glory, others for justice, but all, without exception, would be marked by the weight of their choices. The Battle of Philippi was not just an armed confrontation. It was the final wound of the Republic, the last cry of an era dying before the eyes of a new world being born. And, as in every good Roman tragedy, blood was not enough. Something more was needed. Silence was needed. That silence that only exists when everything that could be said has already been buried with the dead. Now, tell me, do you think Brutus was a traitor or a misunderstood hero? Share in the comments. Your perspective could change everything. If you felt the weight of this story, if something inside you awakened, even if silently, then perhaps this is not just another ancient narrative. Perhaps it is a reflection of your own journey. Because, just like Rome, we all face our internal battles. We all have our Brutus, our Cassius, our ghosts and open wounds. And that is exactly why this channel exists. Here, each story is not told just to entertain, but to provoke, to transform, to show that even in the blood-soaked fields of antiquity, it is possible to find reflections of the choices we make today. You are not alone on this journey. With each video, each account, we are building something greater, a community of awakened minds, of souls seeking meaning, courage, and inspiration. So, if this message touched you in any way, don't let it get lost. Leave your like now. This is not just a button, it is a spark that ignites this movement. And subscribe to the channel, because here transformation is continuous. Each new video is an invitation to reflect, grow, and act. And when you comment, like, share, you are helping this flame reach other lives. People who, perhaps like you, are in need of a new vision, a new strength, a new mission. So come with us. Be part of this community. Because history may have started in Rome, but true change begins now, with you. Rome never slept in silence. In the narrow alleys and filthy back streets of Suburra, the cries of the common people mingled with the distant sound of military drums. In the aristocratic hills, sumptuous dinners were held under ceilings adorned with gold, while treacherous eyes studied the next move on the political chessboard. But in 44 BC, something made all sound cease for a moment. Something that made the very heart of the Republic stop beating. Julius Caesar. A name that, for the poor and soldiers, represented justice, bread, and victories. For the senatorial elite, however, he was the harbinger of the end. Born into an impoverished patrician family, Caesar built his greatness with cunning, bravery, and unwavering ambition. He marched through Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, defeated Pompey, was acclaimed by crowds, and in no time, concentrated in himself a power that no Roman had ever dared to dream of. He became dictator for life. His face was stamped on coins. His name was celebrated in theaters. He was loved, adored, revered, and feared. For the nobles who held the memory of ancient republican freedoms, Caesar was not just a political risk, he was a cosmic error. A man who, by challenging the order, threatened to transform Rome from a republic into a disguised monarchy. And this, for the defenders of the old guard, was intolerable. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, the famous Ides of March, the corridors of the Senate became corridors of death. Caesar entered dressed in his white toga, greeted with respect by those who had already decided his fate. He walked to his chair, sat down, and then, the first dagger was plunged. The betrayal was swift, precise, brutal. Among the assassins was his protege, his friend, his politically adopted son, Marcus Junius Brutus. And when Caesar saw him among the conspirators, he did not scream in pain. He did not curse. He merely whispered a phrase that would echo through the centuries, "Et tu, Brute, It was not just a question. It was a wound deeper than any blade. It was the collapse of trust. The collapse of the soul. The body of Julius Caesar fell before the statue of Pompey, his former rival, as if fate mocked him until his last breath. But his death did not bring peace. It did not restore the Republic. On the contrary, it opened the gates of hell. Rome plunged into chaos. The Senate tried to regain control, but there was no control left to regain. The people, upon learning of the assassination, became inflamed. In the streets, crowds wept, screamed, set fires. At the funeral, when Caesar's will was read, revealing that he had left his fortune to the people and named his young grandnephew, Octavian, as heir, the chaos intensified. The flames of revolt ignited the fuse of civil war. On one side, the assassins Brutus and Cassius fled to the east, convinced they had liberated Rome. On the other, two men thirsty for revenge emerged: Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man and influential general, and the young Octavian, only 19 years old, but with a mind as sharp as the dagger that killed his adoptive father. Initially rivals, Octavian and Mark Antony drew closer out of convenience. They realized they would not defeat Caesar's assassins divided. Thus, in 43 BC, the Second Triumvirate was formed, an alliance formalized between Octavian, Mark Antony, and Liberators, with full powers to reorganize the state. It was at this moment that Rome, which once prided itself on being a land of laws, plunged into an institutionalized nightmare: the list of prescriptions. Prescription was not merely a death decree. It was a sentence without trial. A line on a papyrus meant that the name no longer had the right to life. The names multiplied. Former senators, commanders, personal enemies, public figures, all were at risk. It was as if the gods of war had descended and dictated their own rules. And among these names, there was one that symbolized all that Rome had once been great: Marcus Tullius Cicero. A brilliant orator, philosopher, defender of the Republic, Cicero tried to resist with words, but words were worth nothing in a world dominated by swords. He tried to flee, tried to negotiate, but was captured. His head was severed and displayed in the Roman Forum, along with the hands that once wrote speeches. The image of Cicero's head impaled echoed a terrible message: there was no longer room for free voices. Caesar's revenge was not only against his assassins, it was against everything and everyone who dared to dream of the Republic's return. Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus now held absolute power. And this blood united them, but also separated them. The clouds of war continued to form. The East was becoming the refuge of the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius gathered armies, allies, promises. They knew the final struggle was approaching. They knew that Rome had yet to decide its true fate. But for that, it would be necessary to confront the heirs of power. It would be necessary to cross seas, form legions, and spill more Roman blood. The next battle would not just be between men. It would be between world views. Between past and future. Between the freedom of the few and the empire of the many. And then, with the roar of armies and the shadow of destiny, the world marched towards Philippi. The echo of Caesar's last words still resonated in the corridors of the Senate when Brutus and Cassius, their tunics stained with the dictator's blood, hurriedly left Rome, knowing that the past demands a heavy price. They were not just fleeing the city, they were escaping the fury of an idea: that Caesar, even in death, would not be forgotten or forgiven. On the other side of the Adriatic Sea, in the vast Roman East, the provinces welcomed the assassins as liberators. Here were the heirs of the old Republic, the last men in togas in a world that was already donning armor. Brutus and Cassius, even in the face of guilt and doubt, raised armies with the help of exiled senators, governors, and local leaders who saw in that cause the last spark of freedom. They were men with ideals, yes, but also with fear. the fear that Caesar, even in his absence, would become more powerful than he ever was in life. The fear of a faceless empire, commanded by ambitious youths and generals thirsty for revenge. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Second Triumvirate was consolidating itself not only with decrees but with blood. Octavian and Mark Antony knew that the true enemies were far away, beyond the hills of Greece, in the uncertain fields of Macedonia. It was there that the decisive battle of the new era would take place. They summoned troops, collected taxes, promised rewards. Men were called by the thousands. Entire legions were raised for the march. Roman destiny, once again, depended on the swords that would cross seas. War was inevitable, and everyone knew it. Brutus, the most contemplative of the assassins, saw war as a necessary tragedy. He bore the burden of having betrayed a friend in the name of the homeland. He said he killed Caesar, not out of hatred for the man, but for what he represented. He was an idealist, but also a tortured dreamer, someone who read Greek philosophy between one tent and another. His expression was always serious, his eyes turned inward, as if he conversed more with his conscience than with the soldiers. Cassius, on the other hand, was made of different stuff. A veteran soldier, he knew the game of power and understood that ideals do not win battles. His hard face and constant distrust contrasted with Brutus's lightness. For him, war was practical, not poetic. He knew that the triumvirate would march against them with full force and that there would be no room for mistakes. He told his men that they were not fighting just for freedom, but for their very survival. His eyes sought not redemption, but victory. On the opposite side of the sea, Mark Antony led the troops with the vigor of a general forged in battles. He was charismatic, popular among the soldiers, and carried within him the flame of revenge. For him, the fight at Philippi was not political, it was personal. Caesar had been his friend, his mentor, perhaps his only respected authority figure. And the blood spilled on the Ides of March still boiled in his memory. Antony was a man of action, impulsive, driven by passions and the desire to destroy everything that represented betrayal. Ottaviano was the complete opposite. Young, fragile, often ill, but with an ambition that bordered on the divine. In the eyes of others, he was nothing more than a spoiled boy, an heir who leaned on Caesar's name to keep himself upright. But those who underestimated him paid dearly. Ottaviano was cold, methodical, patient like a silent predator. His mind worked beyond the battlefield. While Antony shouted orders, Ottaviano plotted strategies for the post-war. He knew that Macedonia was not just a battlefield, it was the springboard to the throne that Rome pretended not to have. And it was in this tension that the two worlds collided. The legion set out, crossing seas, plains, and mountain ranges. From Rome, they traversed Greece and reached Macedonia, an ancient land, shaped by myths and past wars. There, Alexander the Great had been buried. There, the echoes of Hellenic glory still whispered among mountains and valleys. But now, it was the sound of drums and hooves that dominated the horizon. The terrain at Philippi was treacherous. Marshy in parts, covered by dense forests in others. Visibility was limited. The movement of troops was slow and dangerous. Men sank into the mud up to their knees. Horses slipped on the damp ground. It was as if the very earth refused to choose a side. The Republicans quickly erected fortifications, taking advantage of the natural hills of the region. They had fewer soldiers, but more knowledge of the terrain. It was a war of patience and endurance. Cassius was suspicious of everything. Brutus sought inspiration in ancient texts. Both knew that this would be their last chance to keep the flame of the Republic alive. On the other side, the Triumvirate's army was larger, but also more unstable. Antony was loved by his men, but his impulsiveness worried the commanders. Ottaviano, in turn, had fallen ill during the journey and hardly participated in the initial preparations. But his presence, though silent, was a constant reminder: Caesar is with us. The tension between the two sides was not just political, it was spiritual. It was the clash between old Rome and new. Between the gods of the past and the men who wanted to become gods. Each step on the trails of Macedonia echoed like a prophecy being written. Each soldier knew what was at stake. It was not just territory. It was the soul of Rome. And when the first trumpets announced the beginning of the battle, the world held its breath. The dawn of October 3, 42 BC was shrouded in a dense fog over the soaked fields of Philippi. The humidity clung to the helmets, and the scent of wet earth mingled with the iron of sharp swords. An almost absolute silence. A silence that seemed to honor the final minutes before a fate that no one could avoid any longer. The two fronts were prepared. On one side, Brutus and Cassius. On the other, Antony and Octavian. It was the first great clash between the ideals of the past and the brute force of the present. The moment for which the gods, the ghosts, and the living had been waiting for years. The first move came from Brutus. Still young, but already hardened by the weight of his choices, he led with intelligence and discipline. His troops advanced strategically, opening gaps in the wing commanded by Octavian. The fight was fierce. Shields clashed like thunder. Spears flew like swarms. But gradually, the line of Caesar's heir broke. Octavian, sick, frail, and removed from the field, could not withstand Brutus's determined momentum. Octavian's camp fell. It was an undeniable victory. The tents were looted, the standards toppled. The Republican soldiers raised cries of triumph. Brutus, perhaps out of prudence or hesitation, did not advance. He did not pursue. He did not crush what remained. He refused to abandon the ordered formation, fearing an ambush. That caution, which in the mind of a philosopher was wise, in the logic of war was fatal. At the same time, on the other side of the field, Cassius faced a storm. Mark Antony, in contrast, fought with fury. His soldiers crossed the terrain like human arrows. Cassius, even experienced, could not contain the momentum. His wing was pushed back, his flank exposed. Communication between him and Brutus was severed by distance and the chaos of battle. Amidst the smoke and screams, Cassius received an erroneous report: Brutus had fallen. His heart, already fractured by the tension of the previous days, collapsed. Seeking refuge on a hill, where the wind carried away the sound of swords, Cassius looked at the horizon and saw no hope. His last decision was not military, it was existential. He asked his loyal freedman, Pindarus, to assist him. With his eyes fixed on the cloudy sky, he uttered the words of a man who believed he had failed. Pindarus, with trembling hands, held the sword. And Cassius threw himself upon it. He fell there, among rocks and earth, unaware that Brutus had defeated Octavian, that the game was still open, that Rome was still waiting for an outcome. The news of Cassius' death arrived hours later, like an invisible blow to Brutus's back. The face of the Republican commander closed. His eyes, usually turned to the future, plunged into the void of the present. He ordered that Cassius' body be honored, that the rituals be fulfilled. Not as a symbolic gesture, but as a tribute to one who had believed in the cause until the end. From that moment on, Brutus was alone. Alone with his thoughts, his ghosts, and the weight of the entire war on his shoulders. The soldiers, still celebrating the capture of the enemy camp, did not know that the price of victory was higher than they could imagine. In the following nights, the Republican camp was enveloped in a heavy silence. The torches burned low. The eyes of the legionaries sought in Brutus not just orders, but faith. And the commander, once a philosopher, once a disciple of the Stoics, began to speak less and carry more. He knew that the decisive moment was yet to come. He knew that the soul of Rome had not yet chosen its new lord. And now, without Cassius, he would be the only one to guide her. The winds of late October carried more than dust and dry leaves over the already devastated fields of Philippi. They bore the sweet scent of death and the muffled murmur of an inevitable fate. The fog that once concealed armies now revealed the exhausted men, with deep-set eyes from insomnia and faces marked by dust, hunger, and fear. Brutus, darker and quieter since Cassius' death, gazed at the horizon without hope for a miracle. He knew that time was not on his side. His soldiers, once inflamed by Republican ideals, now looked to him for a reason to continue. The supply of provisions was running low. Morale was in tatters. And yet, on that cold dawn, Brutus gave the order that would define the future of Rome. Today, we fight to the last drop of blood. The battle began with a faint light filtering through the mist. There were no fiery speeches, no glorious trumpets. Just the heavy sound of men marching toward the abyss. The two armies met in the center of the devastated field, and like caged animals, they hurled themselves at each other with the fury of those who know there will be no tomorrow. It was no longer a war of strategies. It was raw survival. Spears shattered against shields. Helmets were torn off. Men fell screaming their mothers' names. Each step demanded more than muscles, it demanded soul. And the souls there were already torn apart by the sequence of deaths, losses, and disillusionments. The legionaries of Mark Antony, better fed, more disciplined, and led by a commander thirsty for glory and blood, advanced like a living wall. Antony, with his charismatic presence and thundering voice, shouted orders like an emperor before being crowned. He knew this was the moment. Brutus tried to reorganize his line, shouted orders, moved his troops with what little energy and faith remained. But it was too late. The flanks were surrounded. The escape routes cut off. And one by one, his men fell like leaves in the autumn that enveloped them. Surrounded. Cornered. The philosophical air of a crumbling republic no longer saw the point in resisting. Brutus, stained with mud and blood, retreated to a nearby grove with a few loyal soldiers. He was not fleeing, he was merely seeking silence. The clearing where he stopped seemed a natural temple, as if the forest itself respected the moment. There, without glory or audience, he chose his end. He handed his sword to a close friend and asked for help to do what Cassius had already done weeks before. Rome has lost. At least let me not lose myself. With one last breath, he plunged against the blade. His eyes remained open, gazing at the sky, as if seeking some answer there. But none came. Hours later, the news of his death spread across the fields like distant thunder. The surviving Republicans, upon learning of Brutus's end, threw their weapons to the ground. Many surrendered. Others preferred the same exit as their leaders, driving iron against their own chests. And there, among the fallen bodies and the invisible statues of memory, an entire era came to an end. The Republic did not fall with speeches in the Senate. It toppled among the muddy stones of Philippi, carried on the shoulders of the last men who believed in it until the end. Mark Antony walked among the bodies as if crossing an altar profaned by the gods. The field of Philippi, once a stage of glory and promises, was now an open-air cemetery. Men who carried ideals, swords, and hopes lay in silence, and among them, Brutus, the last of the Republicans. Before the corpse of his enemy, Mark Antony did not celebrate. His eyes, hardened by war, recognized in Brutus's pale face the nobility that politics had never understood. He ordered that the body be treated with honor, embalmed with respect, cremated with dignity. A worthy funeral, as Rome did for its greatest men, even though Rome was no longer the same. Meanwhile, Octavian watched everything from a distance. Young, sickly, but lethal. His victory was not just military. It was political, it was symbolic, it was definitive. He did not bow before Brutus, nor did he shed a tear. To him, Brutus was just another piece removed from the board. The game was still in progress, and he was already thinking about the next moves. The war had ended, but the cleansing began there. Octavian silently began to eliminate his adversaries. Generals who had hesitated, senators who still sighed for the Republic, opportunistic allies who now seemed unnecessary. He did not shout, did not threaten. He simply acted. With the coldness of a strategist who knew exactly what he wanted, absolute power. Mark Antony, as charismatic and strong as he was, still saw politics as a stage for speeches and alliances. Octavian did not. He saw a throne. And Rome, weary of wars, would accept anyone who promised stability, even if it cost her freedom. Caesar's victory was complete. His assassins dead. His ideals avenged. But with this, the seed of the empire germinated beneath the rubble of the Republic. Not with applause, but with silence. The voice of history, now like a whisper cutting through the darkness, echoed among the cracked marbles of the Senate and the silent swamps of Macedonia. In the mud of Philippi, Rome traded the Republican dream for absolute power. The price of betrayal was not just blood, it was the end of an era. And so, amidst crossed swords, honorable suicides, and limitless ambitions, we witness not only the fall of men, but the collapse of an idea. The Roman Republic, shaped by centuries of debates, laws, and civil conflicts, crumbled under the weight of revenge and the insatiable desire for control. Julius Caesar, even in death, triumphed. And he triumphed because he instilled in his heirs, Mark Antony and, above all, Octavian, the desire for eternity. What Brutus sought to preserve with his dagger, Octavian would destroy with his silence and strategy. Brutus, with his philosophical mind and wounded soul, wanted to save Rome from a tyrant. But in the end, it was his death that sealed the definitive tyranny. Mark Antony, despite his passions and impetuosity, still had traces of honor. Octavian, disguised as a defender of the people, transformed Rome into an empire, crowning himself as Augustus, the first emperor, and forever ending the illusion of freedom that remained. The mud of Philippi did not dry under the sun. It dried with forgetfulness. And in the silence that followed, Rome rewrote its history, as all powers do, on the side of the victors. But the question that echoes to this day, crossing centuries, broken marbles, and the ashes of dead senators is, what if Brutus had won? What if the Republic had survived the storm? Now, I want to invite you to something greater. If this story touched you, if it awakened in your heart more than curiosity, if it made you think about the value of choices, freedom, honor, and ambition, then this mission is yours too. Here, on this channel, we are building a community that not only consumes stories, but lives and reflects with them. Each video is more than content, it is a call. To remember. To understand. To transform. Because knowing the past is the only way not to repeat the same mistakes in the future. So leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications. But not just for me. Do it so that this message reaches more people. So that more lives are touched by these stories. So that more minds awaken. So that, together, we become an army of awareness in an age of distraction. And now, I invite you to go even deeper. In the next episode, we will dive into an empire born from the blood of the Republic, the machinations of Octavian, the disputes with Mark Antony, and the enigmatic and dangerous role of Cleopatra, the woman who seduced Rome. Do you think you know the story? Wait until you see what comes next. In the comments, tell me, would you have done what Brutus did? Was Octavian a hero or a villain? Let's talk. Because it is in conversations that history remains alive. Thank you for watching until now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep receiving the upcoming content. Until the next video.